Started back. Chairman McMillan, we're still in Fisheries Committee, sir.
Say something before you start. For everyone up here, the microphones are new. Don and I have discussed it. It has what's called a noise gate, so whatever you say, it won't be heard, so speak it quiet. So Jeff, you would say, I didn't hear you, I didn't hear you.
Chief Wilson is going to discuss with us too about stocking overview of our hatcheries.
Thank you, Commissioner McMillan. At the last meeting, our statewide hatchery coordinator, David Roddy, gave a real good overview of our hatchery program, and in the process of talking about that, he mentioned about stocking of the fish. Commissioner Baker asked about some cost of fish and things like that, so we got to discussing this among ourselves, and in fact, the regional Fisheries Program Coordinator, Region 3, Mark Thurman, suggested, why don't we go back and give a better overview of why we stock fish, not just what we stock, but maybe why we stock them. So that's kind of why we came up with this presentation for today. Why do we stock fish? David gave a number of recommendations or reasons why we do it. The obvious one is to establish a population. If you got a new lake, a new pond, body of water, something like that, you got to put fish in there. They're either going to get in there from migrating downstream from a pond or upstream from a body of water. Or maybe somebody's going to, well-intentioned fisherman might want to put some fish in there himself. So one of the reasons that you stock a body of water is to establish a population. Could be a new species. This is, I won't say this is our newest species, but it is a relatively new species. We started stocking striped bass in the mid-'60s. They didn't, before that time, they were saltwater fish that migrated freshwater to spawn, and they got landlocked in South Carolina accidentally, and it turned out they do pretty well in freshwater, but that's a relatively new species to be introduced. Events such as kids fishing rodeos, we stock lots of catfish for these kids fishing rodeos. And in winter trout fishing, we stock lots of trout for the wintertime for those who provide an extra fishery in the winter when most fishing activities don't take place because of the cold weather. People can go fishing for trout. And restoration, restoring species that used to be here, like the lake sturgeon or the alligator gar, or even the southern Appalachian strain of the brook trout. We do some stocking of those species. And if you want to throw this one up there, even fish kills could be a form of restoration, where a section of a river maybe, or perhaps a pond or lake, they have fish kills, so you have to restore the population that way by stocking. We stock a few endangered species. Most we contract with, but with private conservation organizations that raise them, but we do allow for the stocking of endangered species. That's another method and a reason for stocking fish. We also stock fish to provide us with a brood stock. The black-nosed black crappie on the left, we have a real good population of those at Normandy Lake, and which is, of course, right next to Normandy Fish Hatchery. And we've maintained a very good brood stock population in that lake. Sauger, we have some regulations. The 15-inch regulation is to protect some of our brood fish below in some of our tailwater areas. And in walleye, we have a couple places that are really good for us to go back to and get some walleye, some decent numbers of walleye for providing for a brood fish. We also have experimented with a special strain, I believe it's called Rock Castle, up in the Fort Patrick Henry Lake. It didn't have any walleye in there. We got some from Kentucky and been putting them in there to try to establish a special strain of walleye. We think these are the River Run walleye, and in some places like Norris Lake, the River Run walleye seem to be not disappearing, but the numbers seem to be decreasing, so we're trying to reestablish that population there. Probably the biggest reason that we stock fish is for enhancement. And enhancement is, if you look at the definition in the dictionary, it's just to make things better. Basically, it's all kinds of definitions, but you simplify it down to one thing, it's to make things better. And for our purposes, maybe to make fishing better. one of the goals in our division is to provide a diversity of fisheries to a diversity of fishermen. And we've got them. I mean, we've got all kinds of fish in our state. Smallmouth bass, striped bass, trout, muskie, big cat fishermen, and walleye, and even crappie. And so we've got a diversity of these fisheries, and the reason that we do is because we have a diversity of habitats. We have the wild trout streams up in the far east, all the way down to the Mississippi River, to the far west, and everything in between. We have 30 man-made reservoirs. We have Reelfoot Lake, which is the only natural lake in our state of any size. We have 19,000 miles of streams, and we have tailwater. We have 18 warm water and 12 cold water. But for those man-made structures like the dams and the reservoirs, it hadn't always been that way. Found this map in a book that was in my office. It's 1939. I know it's a pretty busy map, and I'll try to just briefly glance over it. But if you look at the circles and the squares and the triangles, in 1939, almost all fish that were stocked were trout. There's one record of it looks like it might be Reelfoot Lake where they stock Kentucky bass for some reason. But all the other circles indicate those are the fish that were in that population when they did the analysis to try to do the collections to find out what fish were there. So we're talking about trout. We do have a variety of trout fisheries, and we do enhance a lot of these trout fisheries. Some we put trout in for mitigation purposes, like below the tailwaters and even up in the reservoirs, but they're, for the most part, the trout don't reproduce a lot in our state. The wild trout do up in the east part. We have some that reproduce in some of our well-known trout tailwaters like South Holston, the Watauga, and the Clinch. And even some of the streams, there's some reproduction going on too. But we have to stock streams like in the eastern part of the state, particularly the trout streams in the springtime. We stock in March and April and probably May. But if we didn't stock those trout in there, they wouldn't be there. And then over the summer, they may die out because the water gets too warm. But we do provide that springtime fishery. We also have a delayed harvest. A few of those places where we put them in the fall and they grow throughout the fall and they catch and release them, then they can, when the water gets too warm later in the summer, they can start keeping them. So, and the reservoirs, we stock the lake trout and rainbow and brown trout into those. So we do have a variety of trout fisheries, and these are all, for the most part, considered a form of enhancement. And just, this was part of David's presentation last month. We stock mostly rainbow trout. And most of the species that we raise, majority of the species that we raise in our state hatcheries are rainbow trout. And to give you an idea of how many trouts we stocked in 2013, it was over 500,000 pounds. And this includes a big percentage of them came from Del Hollow National Fish Hatchery. Going back to that map again, that terrible busy map. One thing that if you would notice this, in 1939, these were all rivers for the most part, except Norris Lake. It was the first, I guess, the first major impoundment constructed in the state, and it was in 1936. It was the first one constructed by TVA, and so there was not a need to stock a lot of fish back in that time. And then over the course of time, as you know, we've gotten a lot of reservoirs that have been built in our state, 30 man-made reservoirs, and when those lakes were first flooded or first impounded, they were over ground that had never been flooded before, at least not permanently, and they were very productive. People did most of their fishing from the bank. A few fortunate folks had boats that they could go out and fish for, but back in the days, they just fished for whatever they could catch for the most part. We didn't do a lot of stocking back in then because there was not a need to stock. They could take care of themselves. The fishing pressure wasn't that great, and people just caught whatever they could catch. They didn't specify anything, but habitat was great back in the days. This is probably an over-exaggeration. Most of the bigger reservoirs had stumps, but didn't have a lot of trees below them, but they still had a lot of stumps. And over time, these stumps and trees have pretty well disappeared because of just because one thing, over time they've deteriorated, but also a lot of the reservoirs, particularly up in East Tennessee, they have these drastic major drawdowns, and it exposes the brush and the stumps and the woody structure to the air, and it decomposes quicker. There's also other things that have affected and impacted the fisheries over time, and that's people have gotten to be better fishermen. And nowadays, people don't just go out. Some people go out just to catch whatever's biting, but a lot of people target certain species of fish. They may be just bass fishermen. They may just be crappie fishermen or just walleye fishermen or something like that. And they've got GPS units, they got side scan sonar, they've got videos, YouTube, magazines. They've gotten a whole lot better at it. And as a result, there's more pressure on our resources. That coupled with the habitat degradation over time, the waters that were once more productive have cleared up over time too, so they're not as productive as well. So we have to stock. In 2013, as David showed in Greenville, we stock a lot of walleye, we stock a lot of striped bass, and a lot of crappie and sauger. And I'm going to try to go into why we stock each one of these species and why we don't stock others. As I mentioned, the striped bass and the hybrid striped bass, they are the hybrid, of course, is a cross between the white bass and the striped bass. And the striped bass they don't reproduce in our tributary reservoirs and maybe not much in our mainstream. There's some evidence that they're reproducing in Kentucky Lake or Barkley Lake, but they may be migrating through from the Ohio River into the locks and dams. We don't have any proof of that, but we don't stock there, and they're there. So something's happening. But for the most part, we have to stock the striped bass and the hybrid striped bass in our lakes, our bodies of water, in order for them to be there. They wouldn't be there otherwise. And we stock them. We did stock them. The reason we did was because they occupy a zone in the water typically that's more of an open water zone, whereas largemouth bass and smallmouth bass typically occupy near shore zones of lake. Now there is some overlap, but for the most part, they occupy different parts of the water column, and striped bass and hybrid striped bass eat shad mostly, and a lot of those shad are out in the open too for a lot of times of the year. Walleye, we never used to have to stock walleye. They did it. They're native. They were able to migrate up the streams and provide their self-sustained populations. But several years ago, we started at TWRA intentionally stocked alewife into Dale Hollow Lake, into Watauga Lake. And the alewife is not a native. It's more of a cold-tolerant prey fish, kind of like a shad. The reason we did that was because in those colder lakes, Watauga and Dale Hollow, every year, or maybe not every year, but every year or two, the threadfin shad would die out because of the cold water. And even the gizzard shad would suffer some. So we wanted to put a fish in there that was more cold tolerant. And the alewife, being from the northern areas, was more cold tolerant. It's worked out great. The walleye have gotten fat. The smallmouth have gotten fat. All the fish that benefit from eating shad-type fish do well because these alewives stay in the water, and they don't die. They don't die out every year like the threadfin shad do. Since that time, alewives have been transferred to other bodies of water that have got walleye. They're in Norris. They're in Melton Hill. They're in Tellico. They're Timms Ford, Center Hill. And so they've been transferred around by fishermen, whether they buy them as bait or they've dipped them up in dip nets or cast nets and use them for bait and spread them around and released them. So wherever we have alewives and walleye, we have pretty much a collapse of the reproduction, the recruitment of walleye in those lakes. We suspect a number of things we haven't been able to prove, but the alewives could be up in the same areas that the walleye are when they're spawning. It could be eating the eggs. It could be eating the fry. There is also some suggestion and some research that suggests that maybe when the walleye eats the alewives, that it's some kind of enzyme inhibitor that doesn't allow the eggs to form, or maybe they're weak and so they don't hatch. But whatever the case may be, wherever we've got alewives and walleye, we don't have good successful recruitment. So we have to stock those bodies of water. Crappie, some places we wouldn't even think about stocking crappie, like Reelfoot Lake or pretty much Kentucky Lake. They're crappie factories. They do a good job almost every year of recruitment. But some bodies of water we go in and stock. In fact, Tennessee was the first state to even stock crappie in the country. And the first one I think was Watts Bar, but When I was a student at Tennessee Tech in the mid-'70s, I used to go fishing for crappie at Center Hill, and it was pretty good. It was okay. The population declined drastically for whatever reason, habitat, spawning habitat, who knows what, but Anders Murr, a deceased fisheries biologist from Region 3, decided he was going to experiment and try to put crappie back into Center Hill, and he did, and it was successful. And we've done it for a lot of the lakes too, like Del Hollow and Center Hill and elsewhere. So to the point now where we raise a lot of crappie in stock, and we've had a lot of success doing that and establishing and maintaining and enhancing the population. So those are three major species that we stock. We also stock the sauger. We call it Tennessee's mystery fish. Some of the places that we stock sauger probably would have low numbers, if any at all. The Cumberland River system, back years ago, we did a study with Tennessee Tech University, and they determined that about 80% of the sauger that were collected were from what we stocked. So we provided a fishery there. Below Pickwick Dam on Kentucky Lake, forever that sauger fishery has been good, except for about the last 10 or 15 years. And so we're actually gone back in for the last 4 or 5 years and stocking stocking sauger there to try to rebuild that population back up, see if we can improve the numbers of harvest. And we raise some bluegill and red ear sunfish. These are, we typically don't have to raise these. They reproduce on their own, but we do it to supplementally stock. Maybe if there's a new lake being built, we try to raise some for that, or we put some to try to build up a population of red ear sunfish, for example, in a smaller lake somewhere. And we even put some up in Reelfoot Lake, trying to increase the numbers of red ear sunfish up there. And the Florida bass. The Florida bass is really a type of enhancement. We don't stock Florida bass to increase the number of bass. We've stocked the Florida bass to increase the genetics in that population. And we've talked about the Florida bass before. I'm going to talk about it next month, but I won't get into that too much, just to say that that we're trying to influence the genetics with Florida bass, but not try to increase the number of Florida bass in a body of water. We'd have to put a whole lot more in there. So that gets into why we don't stock. I mean, we've covered why we do stock some, and we have a good number of anglers. I mentioned the diversity of fishermen that we have in our state. We have a decent number of walleye fishermen, sauger fishermen, striped bass fishermen, trout fishermen, crappie fishermen. Some people just fish for whatever's biting. We do have more people that fish for bass than the other species in our state. So, question may be asked: why don't we stock bass? More bass, except for the Florida bass that I mentioned. We are experimenting around with some smallmouth bass. We're trying to enhance. See if we can't improve the numbers someplace. So we've done it at Douglas Lake we've been stocking there from that Henderson Island. It's about a 6-acre rearing pond that we put smallmouth bass in and release. We don't know how many as far as numbers go, but there's some indication that in that area it's been effective in some of those, by stocking some of those. We put some in Percy Priest Lake. We're trying them in Center Hill Lake. The problem with them, we don't get a lot of success. We're still trying to figure out the best way to spawn the smallmouth bass. And we don't get a lot of numbers in return, but we're working on that. We're improving. So the largemouth bass, again, unless it's for Florida bass genetics or maybe an initial population or something like that, largemouth bass take care of themselves. They spawn every year. They will spawn, and smallmouth bass will too. But if we're talking about mostly about largemouth, they may not have a banner year. They're up and down like all fish species are. But for example, in some of the reservoirs, the big TVA or Corps of Engineers reservoirs, could be a high water event that could impact the success of the spawn, or maybe even a drought, or maybe a cold front would come through and drive the fish off the bed, and the predator other fish would come and eat the eggs or eat the fry. So there are things that influence, but typically there'll be some reproduction going on. And so we don't manage largemouth bass by stocking, again, except for the Florida bass, because they do it on their own. We do it by regulations. We do it by creel limits, by length limits, things like that. That's how we manage the largemouth bass for the most part for our state. But just because we don't spend money stocking largemouth bass because they do it on their own, doesn't mean we don't spend money with management of largemouth bass. For example, we do a lot of population monitoring. The majority of our shocking that we do in springtime is geared towards largemouth bass. And we do some fall electrofishing too. on just about all of our reservoirs every year and our agency lakes. The information that we get from monitoring the populations, we get age and growth data that we take. We have a guy in our office up here is dedicated. It's one of the things he does. Part of his job is to do the age and growth for all the otoliths, which is what these are, which is a bony structure inside a fish. It's kind of like a tree. If you can look these rings on the right one especially, you can see that this fish has got several rings there. It indicates it's probably 4 or 5 years old. And that we can look at the size of the fish versus how old it is to give us an idea if the population is doing well or if it's crowded or growing almost too fast. We get an idea of the link frequencies of the fish in the population as well, too. That gives us an indication of a number of things, including length limits and stuff like that. So our creel surveys, I won't say are all geared towards bass, but a lot of it are geared towards bass information. And so that certain amount of time on a creel program, it goes towards bass management. BITE stands for Bass Information from Tournament Entries. We depend on tournament people to give us this data, but we use this data to help manage our bass fisheries in our state. And then, of course, there's the habitat improvements. The bottom right one is looks like a spawning bench, which will benefit smallmouth bass mostly, but we also have attempted to put out cover for all species, but including largemouth bass, but crappie and bass as well. We've done, when the water draws down in the fall and wintertime, we've gone out and seeded some of these mud flats with various types of vegetation, where it's rye or used to use reed canary grass. We don't use that anymore, but we've used various types of vegetation. And when in the springtime, when the water comes up, provides a good nursery and area for the small fish to hide in. As well with the habitat enhancement or fish attractors, again, these are geared towards a lot of species, including crappie, but also bass. We plant cypress trees. We planted those in Percy Priest. We planted some in East Tennessee as well to improve the habitat for fish. And we've experimented with aquatic vegetation. Some places it does it on its own. Some places we've tried to establish at least native aquatic vegetation and not had a lot of luck, but we're still working to it. We're not giving up on it. We're going to keep on. So basically, I guess, let me talk about these other issues here. Another reason that we have to consider stocking fish down the road is the invasion of these aquatic species here, like Asian carp and zebra mussels. We know we've got the Asian carp in the Tennessee and the Cumberland River system. Zebra mussels are now in Norris Lake and in Cherokee Lake. The big concern there is that, especially with the zebra mussels in those two lakes, that they're going to filter out a lot of the already low productive waters that's there and make it even tougher for our fish. So probably an even greater need to stock there. And then the Asian carp, same thing. They're going to be competing with our native fish for food and space, and it may be an even greater need for us to stock there. So anyway, that was kind of the overview that I wanted to give about why we stock fish, not just that we stock a lot. It looks like we stock a lot of maybe a disproportionate amount of walleye and striped bass and sauger as opposed to largemouth bass, but I hope I explained the reasons why we have to do that and why we don't have to do that. So we have any questions?
For Chief Wilson? If not, then I guess we're through with you. Appreciate your information. Commissioner Cox, are you a guest here?
They are.
I'll let you introduce them if you don't mind.
When Bobby reported months ago about the success at Chickamauga and with Florida bass, it kind of fired me up about putting them everywhere in the state and the opportunity to sell licenses, and then fishermen would love it and all that. So, and we've been talking about that. And I was talking to Bill Dance one day and just mentioned, bragging on the fisheries guys and Bobby about the Chickamauga and told him what I'd like to see. And the first thing he says, well, you need to talk to Barry Smith and Don Keller. I said, well, who are those guys? Well, he told me, and he bragged on them and about their expertise. Barry was the chief of fisheries in Alabama, and Don was the division research. I'm not positive what Don did, but anyway, they have taken their expertise to the private sector, and they feed their families raising bass. So they kind of have to know what they're doing to do it. But I asked the chairman if he would allow me to ask them to come speak, and I called Barry and Don and asked them, and they agreed, so here they are. Barry, would you like to start?